booting up.
Welcome, everyone. Glad you could join us today for the Words Matter series. So I'm going to kick us off, and we will get into our discussion today about the word crisis. Words matter. Words change the tone, the frame, and behavior. Words can change practice. The adage of sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me isn't really true, because words can hurt, but words can also heal. Welcome to the Words Matter series, where we engage in open and authentic discussions about the impact of common terminology used in child-serving systems with those that are directly affected. Our goal is to illuminate how the terms we use can influence perception. They can influence our approach and our practice, as well as explore alternative language as a means of intentionally shifting how we view and how we interact with youth, families, and with each other. Today, we're going to explore the term crisis or being in crisis. Before we get started, though, please take a moment to consider this term or this phrase, crisis, being in crisis. What comes to mind when you think of that? Using the link that will be put in the chat box, respond to the Menti poll with the thoughts and perceptions that come to mind when you hear this term crisis or being in crisis. And what we're going to see is a word cloud come up as people begin to answer that Menti. You'll see the link in the chat box if you'll click on that, and there's a code to enter. And as people begin to respond as what comes to mind, there we go, urgency, we'll start to see the word cloud. Scared, unstable, crazy. Emergency, oh, Ukraine. Yes, that's definitely at the forefront of everything right now. Turbulence, anxiety, danger, disaster, out of control. As you see these words come up and these phrases, this word cloud shows everyone's responses, but the most common response are the ones that are in the larger font. And so you can see that there's some consistency in the terms and what you think of when you hear crisis or being in crisis. So some of those common perceptions are that, it's emergency, it's distress, stressful, there's danger, disaster. Okay, I think we've gotten everyone's there. Let's see, fear, chaos. I see some that are rising, more panic. Okay, this gives us a good idea of kind of where we are and what comes to mind when we think about this term. Thanks, Joanne. Okay, so let's talk about how this term impacts youth and families whenever we use it. Joining us today are Atlas Underhill, a young adult from Oklahoma, and Jimmy Davis, a parent from Pennsylvania who also serves as a family partner on a mobile crisis team. Both Atlas and Jimmy have personal experience in navigating mental health systems and crisis services and are active advocates in their communities. So I want to thank you both for being here and being willing to share your experiences and your thoughts and your ideas and your perspective, particularly around this term. So we're going to have a few questions. If you have, for those of you that are viewing, if you have questions or comments, please feel free to interact in the chat box. And hopefully we'll have an opportunity as well to address any questions that come up. So Jimmy and Atlas, the term crisis in the behavioral health system seems to have a few definitions. For example, one refers to any situation in which a person's behavior puts them at risk of hurting themselves or others, or prevents them from being able to care for themselves or function effectively in the community. And that's from NAMI. Another defines crisis as a disruption or a breakdown in a person or family's normal or usual pattern of functioning that can't be resolved in the usual way that they would. The second definition seems to fit youth and families a little bit better from my perspective, as what constitutes a crisis is different for every family based on their circumstances, based on their culture, based on their priorities in their life and their experiences and what support systems they have in place. We also hear youth and families referred to or labeled as being in crisis. So starting, Jimmy, with you, from a parent perspective, what does the term crisis mean to you?
From a parent perspective, I would say that crisis means for us, because it's never just me. It's always either me, my child, and or his mother, depending on who's in the house at the time. So I would say that crisis means, summed up in one word, chaos. If it happens immediately, it happens abruptly, and it takes away your train of thought. And you know, when you can't have the train of thought, you can't work your way out of the situation. So that's what brings us into crisis.
Is it defined differently for you in your role as a family partner, as part of a mobile crisis team?
Absolutely. Because as a crisis worker, like you said before, all crises are different for each family, everything that's individual. I find that it's different because people tend to come in with a variety of problems, and it's never what's discussed on the surface. So if a parent calls and they said that they're in crisis because their son decided not to go to school that day, it's never just they didn't want to go to school that day. It's normally these little bursts of crisis that happened before they got to this really big one. And that's just what's on the surface. So you always have to dig underneath to find what's going to be the solution for it.
Okay, thank you. Atlas, what about from your perspective as a young adult? What does it mean to you?
For me, I consider crisis to be when, like, it's out of my personal control, that I need to reach out to some kind of outside resource for some kind of emergency service, because I am no longer able to help myself for whatever reason, whether that be because of, depression or like current status of home, or honestly just anything that might get me to that point where I am no longer capable and need to reach out to an outside service to kind of intervene and be like, hey, okay, this is an emergency. This is where we're going from here.
And as we just said, it's different for every person. You know, so for you, how would you define being in crisis? Is it that lack of control, or are there certain things that as a young adult tend to lead that direction where you kind of feel that out of control?
I have struggled throughout my life with suicidal ideation, and with this, it's been since I was 13, and when I was younger, when I was going into crisis, my parents didn't really know how to help, and so I was kind of put in a hospital each time this happened. And so nowadays, I try to avoid that at all costs, but I still doesn't mean that I don't go into crisis. For me, it's definitely that lack of control and not being able to help myself. Being in crisis is having some kind of internal emergency where I am deeply struggling and cannot, and incoherent, I'm not able to help or control the feelings that I'm experiencing, and I need that intervention.
Hmm. Yeah, that's it's sometimes hard to be aware of that, isn't it? But it
Yeah.
sounds like that's something that you have you've developed a way to say, yep, this is the time. So another question is, the words matter. This whole series is about how certain terms impact youth and young adults and their parents and their family members. And so this is a term that can impact individuals differently. Have what impacts have you seen or personally experienced based on how crisis or being in crisis is used or operationalized in your community?
Everyone, as Jimmy was saying, as you were saying, everyone views that term crisis differently. But receiving mental health services, it felt very specific of the terminology used to define a crisis as to when the therapist or whatever legally has to intervene and seek out crisis services. So, for me, the impact
So
of
narrow.
crisis,
Just to clarify, so it's kind of narrow, like
Yeah.
defined by somebody else.
definitely seems so. Like I remember I would sometimes go to my therapist and I'd be like, yeah, I'm definitely feeling very not okay today, but I would make sure to watch my words and make sure that I was saying like I did not have a plan. I was not actively performing the deed. And yeah, I think those two are pretty much the main things of like, I know not to say this because if I do, then this is considered crisis and there's going to be like, I'm going to be hospitalized again. And so for me, I always had this like very textbook definition for while I was receiving different services. But as I got older and that kind of shifted, I realized that, I'm in crisis more often than when I'm sent to a hospital. Sometimes I'm in crisis, but I'm just at home and things are falling apart. But I had to learn to, to like define that for myself. Because as you said, like everyone sees it differently and it's not just that specific, like there's an active plan that something's going to happen. And so for me, that definition is definitely complicated, but it impacts me to the point where I am afraid of being honest with that feeling because it's that term of crisis is, that means the only way to help you would be this kind of hospitalization route.
Starts a chain of events that may not really be what's necessary.
Yeah. Currently, my therapist is fantastic, and we have different safety plans set in place for different types of crisis. But that term is, I wouldn't say that like it has a negative impact on me, but definitely I have very complicated feelings about it because like previously it was just like, I need to make sure that I'm never in crisis because it will lead to me going to a hospital. And now it's more of, okay, finding, that line of help that will work for that crisis. And being able to like, I'm sorry, I lost that entire train of thought. I'm trying to like get it back.
It's quite all right. Yes, I mean, it does impact people differently. And I've heard other youth say, I know what to say and what not to say because I know the negative things that can happen, if I do that. And so sometimes it can keep you from reaching out for help. And it sounds like that kind of was your experience. Jimmy, how about you? I mean, what are the impacts you've seen or you've experienced around this, how it's used in your community?
The word crisis, you mean?
Crisis or being in crisis, how it's defined. How does it impact people?
Well, what I'm starting to realize is that the actual word itself, because it has so many definitions,
Mhm.
becomes like it's an unusual problem because so many agencies have the word attached to what it is that they do. So, for instance, there is a crisis hospital in Philadelphia. There is a mobile crisis team. There are 3 children's mobile crisis teams. There are 2 adult mobile crisis teams. There are crisis interventions within therapy, um, within different service providers. So the problem becomes who to call for your specific situation. So if there are so many calls that we get as mobile crisis workers where they mean to call the hospital, but they call us. We come out, we do our assessment, and then they have to go to the hospital anyway, or if the hospital was avoidable. So I find that is it's a unique problem, dealing with the word crisis. I also find that when there are so many definitions to crisis and you don't know who to turn to for the specific help that you need, it becomes a problem where you end up in crisis from trying to prevent the crisis. It's a bit of a scramble.
It is. What about if someone refers to you or labels you as being in crisis? How does that feel? How do you react to that?
I think it depends because, and I say that because, as an adult, if I'm in crisis and somebody says, "Hey, you're in crisis," I think that I can take that, and it gives me the feeling of being heard. Like you heard my story, you realized that I was in crisis, and the label of it can get me to a point where I can start to work my way through.
Mm-hmm.
It's different for children though, because once you say, "Hey, you're in crisis," they kind of feel insulted, and it can end up being a completely different situation.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, it's still a bit of a scramble.
Would you say that's true, Atlas?
Absolutely. Do you mind if I branch off of that?
Go ahead.
I have a little bit of pride when it comes to taking care of myself. I'm 18 and I'm living on my own, and I've had to make a lot of decisions that it's not very common for people my age to have to make. And so to me, sometimes when someone mentions like, "Hey, you're in crisis," I immediately go jump on the defense. And it's absolutely wrong of me. But I'm like, no, I'm not. I'm fully capable of taking care of myself, and I'm doing a great job. Thank you very much. But like, it's really hard to recognize that. Because like, to me, being labeled in crisis meant, like I needed that intervention or I needed someone else's help. It's really hard to ask for help sometimes. I think my most recent time going into crisis was caused by like my work starting to cut my hours, and I was like, oh dear, I have no idea how I'm going to pay my bills, and it kind of like led to this internal spiral of like, oh, I'm doing everything wrong, and I had to be like, wait a minute, no. And my roommate was just like, hey man, you look awful, and I'm like, you're right, I do, because I feel awful. I'm currently in mass amounts of distress. Hey, roommate of mine, you want to sit in this room and make dumb jokes with me or like watch a YouTube video or something just to kind of separate my train of thought so that I can collect myself? Like, as you said, it's someone telling you that you're in crisis definitely sometimes feel like someone saying a bad thing. And you want to defend yourself and be like, no, I'm not. I'm perfectly fine, because it feels like it's almost questioning like your ability to prevent yourself from going into crisis or take care of your own mental well-being. But that's absolutely not true. It happens sometimes to everybody. And being able to like take that step back is difficult, I guess.
Takes practice, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Mhm.
And I'm not going to say that I've always gotten it right every time, because that's impossible, but it's being able to be like, no, I do need a little bit of assistance right now.
Mhm. And I think you made a good point in that crises are different. It could be a mental health crisis, and you're spiraling about something, or it's feelings that you're having, but it could be something external that hits you. Your hours being cut. Okay, I've got rent to pay. And that just kind of starts that downward thinking and negativity, and so it happens differently for different people. Jimmy, as a parent, how have you seen the way that crises are handled, or the way that it's used, labeled, affect your child? From a parent's point of view.
You know what? I had been in moments, and this is before I became a crisis worker, that we were in crisis for so long that we just started to live that way and didn't realize that we were in crisis at all, because it became the norm until we finally were able to work our way out of it. So, once we realized that, hey, this is what crisis looks like for us. My child started to get labeled all kinds of, names that I'm sure clinicians, they mean well when they put these stigmas on children. They mean well when they get diagnoses and things like that. But for a child and for other children to hear it, it doesn't sound like they mean well. It sounds like name calling. It sounds like bullying. And, it sounds horrible. So, trying to explain to my child, because of his diagnosis, this is what you are. And he feels like, I'm calling him a name. It would send him into different forms of crisis. 'Cause my son, he has autism, so he'd have meltdowns that would lead into, I'm sorry, he would have tantrums that would lead into meltdowns. And these are whole days spent trying to calm him down.
Mhm.
So it's played all kinds of mean tricks on him.
Yeah.
It's been hard.
As parents, sometimes we know and can tell what's going to set off our kids,
Mhm.
and may send them down that path to a tantrum or a meltdown or a lot of negative self-talk. We may be able to see that. So I find myself sometimes cringing, like, oh, don't say that, don't do that, because I know where that could lead. And so, I see that as maybe one of the impacts as well. And you made a very powerful point about living in crisis, because you do have a point where you're surviving from one issue to the next, and that's exhausting. That's
Correct.
exhausting. And everything seems to be painted with that crisis brush, which can make things difficult. And we know that there can be other ways to describe things that take away some of the stigma, take away some of the impact. There are other ways to document the challenges that we're going through, or our kids are going through, that really consider that youth and family experience in that perspective. Like saying, only you can define really what feels like a crisis to you. So is there something, whether it's alternative language, different terms and phrases to use, or a different approach, something that you would recommend or refer someone else to use in terms of your own child, or just in general, that you see as more effective? Because crisis, as Atlas, you said, it's not necessarily the negative term. And Jimmy highlighted this. Sometimes it's the way in which it's used. If it's narrow, or if it is just applied to anything that's happening, or it can only fit within this box. So if your kid won't get out of bed, that's not a crisis. So yeah. So I guess the question is there another approach? Are there other terms to use? What would you suggest would be better to take into account your experience and perspective?
Are you asking Jimmy or me?
Either one of you, or both, actually. Whoever wants to go first.
I can go if you're not ready, Jimmy, or if you're still thinking.
Yeah, it's a difficult question, so you can say
No,
go
you're
first
fine.
if you like.
Go ahead, Alan.
As I said, the term crisis is difficult because you kind of go into like this internal, like, oh man, that means that I'm doing something wrong. And it's when you're experiencing that mental illness, sometimes like going into crisis and like admitting that you're in crisis is very difficult because of the stigma, and also because it's like you're aware that you have this mental illness and you're aware that your symptoms negatively impact the people around you, and it sometimes feels that like someone being like, hey, you're in crisis, or are you? It's that it negatively impacts other people, but you can't help it. And you get to this point of where you're questioning that. I think that saying like, hey, I noticed that you seem to be kind of struggling right now. What can I provide like to help you in this moment? Crisis, I wouldn't say like saying that you are in crisis. I've never really had an issue with the word itself, just kind of a little bit of difficulty admitting it. I don't think that using crisis to deter, like as the term would be negative, or like needing to find something in place. But I also feel like further explanation other than, like this is a crisis, and more of like a, hey, this seems like something that you're like, there's a crisis going on right now. What do you need like for help, rather than, okay, this is a crisis, you need help. It's, well, what kind of help can we provide? Like what do you think you need? Because they're going to know their situation best.
Mm-hmm. So I'm hearing you say it would be helpful to say, it looks like you're having a rough time right now. It's a rough day, as opposed to saying, oh, you're in crisis, because immediately that means you're at risk of hurting yourself or somebody else, or, that narrow view and the labels and stigma that come with it. But just saying you're having a rough day, how can I help? You're telling your roommate, hey, come and make jokes with me or something, that because you have different ways of dealing with rough days, depending on what the reason behind it. So yeah, that makes good sense.
It's also kind of difficult because when you're in crisis, that means that like oftentimes when you're receiving that help, you're going to have to talk about it. And so by asking like what help you can provide, I think it kind of skips that step, because sometimes like it is healthy to talk about it. There are times where you're in crisis, but for me, I get overwhelmed with words when I'm in crisis, and it becomes very, very difficult for me to speak. I kind of just shut down. And so I feel like asking for what help you need skips the step of, oh, you need to give an explanation for how you're feeling right now. It's just kind of, okay, I see you're struggling. What can I do?
Yeah, that's a good point. With my own child, I have 2 children. One wants to talk and the other wants to not talk about it. And that's what's helpful to them. Just, can you do something else with me rather than talk about that? And the other one's like, I need to sit down and process it. So, I mean, it's so different for each person. So asking that question really would individualize it. Jimmy, did you have a thought?
Yeah. So before my son was born, I worked in hospitality for like a really long time. And one of the things that was always talked about is you can't please everybody. You're really going to try, but everybody can't be satisfied.
Mhm.
So applying that to now, I think that it's more of you can't relate to everybody's story,
Mhm.
but when dealing with anyone that's in crisis, it's better to have empathy and approach them that way. Um, I wouldn't necessarily highlight that they're in crisis because they know that already. They wouldn't have called if they didn't feel that way.
Mhm.
But to approach them with empathy, listen to what it is that they're saying, and then ask questions according to what it is they're telling you is is what I believe to be the best approach to helping somebody through their crisis.
Mhm.
Because if you can find, as I said before, when they get to the point where they've called for help for crisis, they've already had so many little crises occur. So if you can start to answer, or if you can start to help them find the answers for their little questions, and then they can have their aha moment for answering, how do we get out of the crisis right now?
Mhm.
Um, there are a lot of people that return to crisis. So I feel like when you give them the tools to handle their own crisis, it's easier for them to manage crisis later on down the line,
Mhm.
which is a powerful thing.
Yeah. And not to live in that constant state of crisis that
Right,
isn't good for us emotionally, mentally, or physically
right.
to be in
Because
that heightened
before I had, a good group of people that helped me see how to manage my own crisis, I handled everything with a lot of anger. Um, you know, I had so many problems with my son's school. I had so many problems with family members. Um, there were friends that I would like disconnect myself from because they didn't understand what was going on with us. That's a very, very angry feeling to have.
Mhm.
And you carry it. It becomes a very large chip on your shoulder. And if I hadn't found, people who understood and had empathy for me, then I'd still be, you know, 5 years ago in crisis.
Mhm.
So um, that's what I would lead with. You lead with empathy, and then the rest will follow.
Mhm. I like that. Lead with empathy. That's a pretty powerful statement. Yeah. And I see Adamina says it's also very isolating um, when that's something that happens. Um, as a parent, Jimmy, what would you want? Because I know we've got providers that have joined us today. Some are clinicians, some are from the lived experience workforce, maybe have administrators, a variety of people here. As a parent, what would you want those helping you to hear from you and to listen when it comes to your child going through a rough time? Because you know your child the best. What would work?
Well, it's trickier for me.
Mhm.
Say if you ask this question maybe to my son's mom,
Mhm.
she'd have an easier time answering it. Um, the reason that I say that is because, you know, my son we've had to deal with a load of clinicians in and
Mhm.
out. Um, I've been ignored a lot in those conversations, believe it or not. Um,
Doesn't surprise me. We tend to not engage dads as much as we should.
no, no, you
Mhm.
know, I've sat at the table right next to his mom, and they would look me right in my eye and then ask her what is that we should be doing, and not ask us as a collective, but they would ask her, my son was nonverbal for a long time, up until he was about 7 years old. So he's someone that you couldn't ask and get answers from. So they would talk directly to his mom, and knowing that I spent more time with him than she did because she was at work or wherever else, knowing that we spent more time together, would still ask his mom what should be happening. So that question is easier asked of her. But if it were to be asked, what it is that I would want. I'm sorry, can you
Yeah,
repeat
what
the
would you
question?
want anyone who's working with your child to hear from your perspective about your child when they're having a rough time? What do they need to listen to from parents?
Well, I want them to know, one, that, because of my son, he has autism. So I want them to know that every child with autism should be approached differently. You should get to know this child first before approaching this child. And because I'm the best source of knowing who this child is, I want you to take it into consideration, everything that it is that I am saying, because you can see how much I care for him. And once you can see that, then I'm not telling you any way to approach him that's going to be wrong, because I'm trying to get the best for him. So to undermine a parent because they feel like, I went to school for this, I know what's going to be the outcome ahead of time, doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to know what the outcome is going to be. So you need to approach them very carefully.
Yeah. And you made a very powerful point about engaged dads too. It's not just moms, it's parents together. If it's, whether they are together, whether they live separately, whether they are, a same-sex couple, heterosexual couple. I mean, parents know their kid, and it's not just one parent. It's both. So that's also a very powerful statement for people.
Really
to realize.
quickly, if I may. So I'm sure there are a lot of parents here, and they all know the process of consents and releases when you have to get services for your children. I had gone to an assessment for my son, and his mom was running late, so I had to do like the consents and releases, and she was going to be there any minute. And they had already crossed the page out with the father. When you're supposed to get the information for the biological father, that page had already been crossed out because they didn't think that his father was involved. So, it's part of my job as a crisis worker to get consents and releases. So I know that process better than anybody. So I looked for it, and it was something that I knew to look for. But they had to put my name under other because father had already been crossed out.
Oh, I'm so sorry that happened. At some point, we need to have a words matter about implicit bias and assumptions.
Do you mind if I say, honestly, it's really good to see a parent that cares so much and takes the time to know these things about their kids, because my parents weren't really very involved when it came to my mental health stuff. They kind of just said, oh, that's not my problem, I'll leave that to someone else. And I never really had the parents that even took time to really get to know me, and being able to see that. I've had to represent myself most times when it comes to my mental health stuff, and the times that my mom was involved, she was giving completely false information because she didn't take the time to actually learn it. She just had an idea of what she wanted the therapist to think, you know? And it's really important that the parents are involved and are able to say, like, my kid, I know them, and I also recognize that they need help, and I want to be involved in that, you know?
Mhm.
It's really nice to see a family that works together like that.
Thank you for saying that, Atlas. And it's,
Thank you.
you know, whenever a young adult or a youth is, you should be also sharing your information. So it's, you know, not just the parent's perspective. It should be, because we have, and I'm guilty of this myself. I know what I would like my child to work on in therapy, but is that what they want to work on? Because if it's my plan, it's not going to do them any good. You know, they're not. So that's an important point too.
Yeah, like definitely making sure, like, to get that balance of like the parent involvement, but also, you know, like listening to the kid, because in the end they're gonna know more about their own feelings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Some time ago, Fredla, the organization that I'm a part of, had a meeting around youth of transition age and family involvement in that. And the thing that came out is the priorities are different. For parents, it's about safety, you know, and so that's what we're looking at is safety. And for the young adult, it's about independence. And those can go together, but a lot of times they do this, you know, but it's a very different approach to where you are based on our different perspectives. So that kind of plays out there too.
If I may, really quickly, Millie, an opinion that I have that is often not really liked by many people, if I'm honest, is crisis isn't for everyone.
Mhm.
You know, the hospital, the mobile team, all of the other services that involve crisis, it isn't for everyone. And the reason that I say that for my specific situation is, as I explained, my son has been nonverbal for quite some time. And he's only now, like he's 11 now, and reached the point where he is what you would call minimum verbal. So he can talk, but he can't express his feelings. So if he is assessed by a crisis worker or a psychiatrist at a crisis hospital, he's not going to get the help that he deserves. He's going to get sent right back home, and we're going to go right back into that hamster wheel because they can't, you know, he can't complete an assessment.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why, you know, with all of these different ways of saying crisis and all of the different definitions that it has, it still doesn't apply to everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And until there's a situation where it can apply to everybody, it's going to be a constant hole that needs to be filled.
Yeah, well said. I think this comes down to what I've heard from both of you is that lead with empathy. I love that. And you're probably going to hear me say this in other places because I love the way you said it. Individualize, you know, and recognize that each person defines what a crisis for them. And you should listen to the expertise and the perspective of the person going through it. So that's, yeah. I just saw, do we have time for question and answer? Do you guys have time for that before we close up for a couple of questions? And I know Atlas is at work. So I'm looking to see if there are any questions that you specifically would like to ask Atlas or Jimmy. If you would put that in the chat box right now. I just opened it up so I could see it. And we can take a couple before we close up. So if there are any specific questions, or Tracy or Adamina, if you saw questions, if you wouldn't mind bringing this forward. And you guys should be able to see the chat as well, but just to say thank you so much, Atlas and Jimmy, for your honesty. You are your child's best expert. See if there are any others. see a
We
lot of
don't have
good-
any questions from Facebook Live at this point.
Thank you. I do see a question. Do you find that you get care for the day-to-day maintenance of symptoms? And I guess that's to both of you.
I'm sorry, can you repeat it?
Do you find that you get care for the day-to-day maintenance of symptoms?
From my perspective, I'm gonna say like kinda, cause not officially, but I have a fantastic therapist who goes above and beyond like the expectations of her job, and she cares about me, and like she's given me permission to like text her if I need advice or if I have a question or something like that. So I would say like yes in that perspective, but not on an official basis, you know, and not like in a real sense where if I needed help outside of, you know, like text, there's not really much I can do.
Okay. And they clarified is crisis addressed primarily, I'm guessing, you know, the day-to-day symptoms to try to prevent it from getting to that point.
Yeah.
I'm going to say no on my end. And the reason that I'm saying no is because, as I explained, crisis isn't for everybody. I can't call, it's ironic for me, but I can't call a mobile crisis team to come assess my son because they're not going to understand what it is he's saying. I can't take him to a crisis hospital because they aren't going to understand what it is he's saying. So they're going to send him home. The best way that I can get through any issue that my son has is for me, myself, or for his mother herself to like slow things down, talk to him calmly, and get him through that situation. Otherwise, you know, he has a therapist and who happens to know him pretty well at this point. But we're gonna have to wait until Thursday to talk to her. So, you know, other than that, because you know she's not a crisis specialist, she can't just stop in anytime because she has other patients. So, if the question is if we're getting it day to day, then the answer is no, unless we can do it ourselves.
So there's somewhat of a gap
Right
there about that. Jimmy, there's a question for you. In your opinion, how can we make services more inclusive of fathers?
Well, it's a two-part thing. One, to be honest with you, because of the line of work, I run into a lot of fathers that just plainly don't believe in mental health or behavioral health. You know, if you're not cool, if you don't have a cold, if you don't have a flu, you're not sick. So they don't believe in it. So I think that the first part is to bring behavioral and mental health awareness to fathers, to men. I think that it's something that should be introduced when your child is born so that you know, it may not be the road that you end up at, but just in case it is, you should be aware that these are some things that could happen. The other part about it is if you do run into a father that's involved, I think once you realize that he's an involved father, just simply ask him what his opinions are. Now, because of the stigma, his awareness may not be the same as what a mother is, because you know mothers work extremely hard. If they are working and taking care of their kids, or if they're leaving their jobs to go and take care of the kids, they just happen to know more about what children are going through on a day-to-day basis than most fathers do. But there are fathers that include themselves in their kids' lives, And when they come home, ask the kid's mother every day, how was his day, or how was her day? What transpired during the day? When you come across those fathers, just try your best to include them and if they don't know, then give them the information so that they do know how to navigate through the crisis system.
So be intentional
Right.
about engaging. Okay. Yeah. One more question. Are respite services helpful when you're in crisis? And I think that may be able to go to both of you, because there's respite for children and for youth to go to. And sometimes the crisis is where you need a break from each other. So, I mean, that could happen. Are respite services helpful?
Absolutely.
It's a good prevention strategy too, I'll tell you that.
Ironically, before I was a crisis worker, I was a respite provider.
Oh, so Jimmy, you've done it all.
Yeah. So everybody needs a break. There are times where it's a lot of crises are basically power controls. So, as a parent, you want your child to be a robot. You want them to do what you said do when you said do it. And if they don't do it, then, you go into crisis. The kid is going to crisis because he's tired of yelling. He's tired of you yelling at him, or she's tired of you yelling at her. And they want to do what they want to do. They want to live their life the way that they intend to live their lives. And, parents want their children to do what they want them to do. So a lot of times it can be simply resolved by a quick break.
Yeah.
And if you can't find like a respite provider, if you can't get, because there are grants like that kind of stuff in Philadelphia. But if you can't get those kind of services, if you have the ability for them to go to a grandparents and aunts or uncles, you get a night out, because everybody needs to get away from that kind of stress from day to day. It's absolutely necessary.
Thank you. Atlas, do you have anything to say about that? About taking a break?
I don't have much experience with respite services if I understand what they are. But like I do agree with Jimmy. Like you need that break sometimes. You need to step away. And I also think it's beneficial, like for the kid to be able to take that break and just like, okay. I'm away from the situation. I'm away from the problem at hand for just a moment, long enough for me to get my head straight. And obviously, like it's not always the answer, but like I do think that it is very much beneficial.
It could be helpful. Yeah. Okay. I have to thank you so much, both of you, for sharing your experiences, your expertise, your perspective, and particularly your ideas and suggestions about the best ways to approach youth and families that may find themselves having difficult days, or weeks, or months. that can happen. Before we close up for today, though, for everybody who's still here, let's return to our initial perceptions and thoughts about this term crisis or being in crisis, and consider now what you've heard and what you've learned during today's discussion. What are some of the things that you're committed to doing within your role to impact how this term is used or not used or operationalized, defined? We're going to do another Menti poll, but this time your responses will be shared on the screen, and they're just going to kind of scroll through. So Joanne has put in the box, in the chat box, the link, if you'll go to that, and just what are some of the things that you're committed to do within your role to impact how this is used or not used? So already we have being more aware and intentional, lead with empathy, letting the family or the individual define what's a crisis for them, actively listen and learn, ask and listen, lots of listen, and use what you hear. Sharing, I see that, in taking nothing for granted, Be more mindful of not throwing around the word crisis because it does mean different things. I'm also seeing things pop up in the chat. Really listen and hear what's being said. Better understanding without bias or stigma, or even recognizing that this can lead to stigma. Peer needs are experts. Let them lead. Ask the young person what they need, not tell them what I think they need. Oh, that's important. I'm a problem solver at heart, and I'm often jumping to that instead of hearing what my kids are saying to me. I'm bad about it. Make no assumptions. Ask questions. You know, being aware of who's in the room, include all opinions. Joan, can you move it down a little bit? There we go. Educate myself. Understand there are many types and levels. Listen to the family as a whole and be aware of language used. Yes. Support families by listening, not to respond. Help families reframing and connect to their experience. Help educate others. Thank you very much, everyone who has been here today and engaged in this conversation. You know, there does seem to be some things that were heard today that hopefully you can take back and use within your role. So I want to thank everybody for joining us today and hope that you'll join us next month. We're going to be talking about youth and family driven as terms. And in closing, we want to challenge you to be intentional in using terms that are more supportive and respectful of the youth and the family experience and their expertise. So thank you again for being here, and remember that words matter. Have a good rest of the week.